I want to talk to you guys about Taiwan, because it's only a matter of time that China invades Taiwan, so I might as well just talk about it now. And that way we can have some understanding of why there are tensions between China and Taiwan, and ultimately between China and NATO over Taiwan. And so when it happens, when the inevitability of a Chinese-Taiwanese war eventually happens, we can have at least some understanding as to why it is, and we don't find ourselves being Johnny-come-latelys, going online or watching some YouTube video where there's all just B-roll and there's a narrator telling you, well, the tensions between China and Taiwan go back to the year 1895 in the first Sino-Japanese War, and the video has 5 million views because nobody knows what the hell is going on and everyone's confused, and like we have been confused since 2020. This is actually an excerpt from a book by Shahid Hussein Raja. It's called International Relations, Basic Concepts and Global Issues. And it talks about, so this is not just some nobody, somebody who doesn't have the credentials talking about Taiwan. This is someone who has obviously studied deeply into this subject matter, and it is kind of a complicated subject matter. But the reason why I am talking about Taiwan is not just so that we can be ready intellectually for something like for a war between China and Taiwan, but I also want to bring up the other factor that other people rarely ever bring up, and that is the factor of Japan. So the thing about Taiwan and China that very few people bring up is that China used to control Taiwan. Historically speaking, it controlled Taiwan. What happened in the 1890s, so from 1893 to 95, I believe, there was a war that broke out between the Chinese and the Japanese. I talked about this in my last video last night, but I'm just going to say it here again. The war was fought over Korea. Who was going to have the influence and the control over Korea? So Korea, right between Japan and China, very big deal geopolitically for the two countries. And Korea, back in those days, was split politically between people who were pro-China and people who were pro-Japan, kind of like today, where you have North Korea that's very pro-China, it's an ally with China, and then you have South Korea, which is an ally with Japan, an ally with NATO. So the two parties were in constant tension with each other, and then what eventually happened was there was a coup that broke out. And it was a pro-Japan coup that broke out in Korea. The Chinese said, we got to get involved because we can't be allowing a pro-Japanese coup to take place in Korea, because that's going to be detrimental to our influence in the region, blah, blah, blah. So China has a bunch of soldiers in Korea squash the pro-Japanese coup, the pro-Japanese movement, crushes it. So the Japanese realize, okay, we got to do something because China's military is in Korea and they have crushed a proxy of ours. So the Japanese eventually deploy soldiers into Korea and a war breaks out. This is the first Sino-Japanese War. First Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese obviously lose that war because, let's be real here, from what I have read and from the history, Japan is a much more martial country than China is. I think Japanese people are they have much better martial dexterity and willpower than the Chinese do. I don't want to insult people, but the Chinese had 2 wars with Japan and really lost both of them. And you could argue and say that the Chinese won because Japan was amongst the losers in World War II, but the Chinese won with the help of the United States, and yeah, that factors in. But before the United States entered, the Chinese, from what I have read, they were really, really losing badly in a war with Japan. So anyway, the Japanese defeat the Chinese in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. Then the Japanese take 2 regions from the Chinese. This is where things get really really relevant to the discussion. The Japanese take the Liaodong Peninsula, and they also take Taiwan from the Chinese. The Liaodong Peninsula is a part of China. It's not an island like Taiwan is. It is a peninsula that is connected to China, the Chinese mainland. Japanese took it over. The Germans, the French, and the Russians forced the Japanese out of Liaodong because the Japanese did not have the capacity to fight 3 countries at once. So the Japanese bounced. They got out of there. Then what happened was the Russians went to the Liaodong Peninsula and they built a military fortress there, and they put a giant naval fleet there, and the name of this fortress was called Port Arthur. So fast forward to the year 1904, the Japanese do a surprise attack on the Russians in Port Arthur, and a war breaks out known as the first Sino, or the first Russo-Japanese War. There was a second Russo-Japanese War in which the Russians were on the winning side because the Soviets were part of the alliance with the Americans and the British. But the Russians, and I know there's a big debate, the Russians will say that they won, but at least, okay, in Western education, the consensus is that the Russians lost the war. The Russians had lost the war. And what happened was that the Americans were so impressed with the Americans, sorry, this music is distracting me. What happened was the Americans were so impressed with the Japanese defeating the Russians that the Americans had this meeting with the Japanese, and they basically said, because at that time the Americans were controlling the Philippines. So the Americans said, "Listen, Japan, I know you're this rising power, and you're really filled with hubris and everything, but we're really asking you to not." I got this Iranian music video. I'm so sorry, guys. We really asked you to not mess with our colony, the Philippines. The Philippines did not gain independence until I think it was like 1940 something. The Philippines was a colony of America for a very long time. So the Japanese said, okay, we won't touch the Philippines, but what's in it for us? The Americans said, well, take Korea. It's yours. Ah, okay, very nice. So the Japanese fought the Chinese over Korea. They defeated the Chinese, took the Liaodong Peninsula, took Taiwan, which is the region where the entire Chinese-American dispute is centered on, really, at least for now. And they were the victors. Well, they lost the Liaodong Peninsula. The Russians sort of took over the Liaodong Peninsula. And then the Japanese defeated the Russians. And the Americans were so impressed that they wanted to really use the Japanese as a sort of check in Asia against Russia, because the Russians have always been really the arch nemesis of the Americans. And the Americans said, take Korea. So Theodore Roosevelt withdraws all U.S. troops from Korea. And then he tells all the Western forces, all the Western governments who had troops in Korea to also withdraw their troops. And they followed through, and they withdrew all of their troops. So Korea was left to the mercy of the Japanese, and the Japanese took over Korea. The point is that the Japanese at one point in time controlled Taiwan. They took Taiwan from the Chinese. And then what happened was, in World War II, the Chinese took Taiwan back. So the Chinese have always seen Taiwan as part of their territory. And the Japanese see it as a country that they once controlled, and they obviously want it back. That's what's happening. So the Japanese have their crosshairs on Taiwan. They used to control it. They were defeated in World War II. They lost Taiwan because they lost in World War II. So Taiwan went back to the fold of China, and they want it back. So when looking at the whole tension over Taiwan, you cannot exclude Japan as a major player in this entire situation. It's impossible. It would be like trying to exclude Germany in the whole problem over Ukraine. Well, Germany has always wanted to control Ukraine. You go back to World War I, World War II. The Germans always had their eye on the Ukrainians. Why? Because Ukraine is a giant breadbasket. Talk to anyone who grew up in Ukraine or who is familiar with the terrain in Ukraine. They'll tell you the soil of Ukraine is unlike any other soil. You throw any seed in the ground in Ukraine and it grows. So the Germans always interested in Korea, or have always been interested in Ukraine. So when talking about the whole war in Ukraine, and we'll get more into that in a little bit here, can't exclude Germany, because Germany also has its crosshairs on Ukraine. And that's why the Americans, I think that's why the Germans are so excited right now, because the Americans have been saying, we got to focus more on the Chinese. Got to focus more on China. Well, we can't really put a lot of focus on China if we're being burdened by Ukraine. So we got to unburden ourselves, to quote Kamala Harris. Got to unburden. We got to be unburdened by what once was, or something like that. And we got to really put the burden of Ukraine on the shoulders of Germany. That's the American plan. This is definitely, if you look at Trump's plan for Ukraine, at least for what it is now, because things like this change overall. But if you look at Trump's plan, part of the plan is to really shift the responsibility over Ukraine to the Germans. They say Europeans, but really it's Germany. Let's be real here. Falco Vaughn says, modern Japan has no claim over Taiwan. They're barely holding on to the Senkaku Islands, who were controlled by China before World War II. Barely holding on. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but yes, there's definitely tension between China and Japan over the Senkaku. And if a war breaks out between Taiwan and China, and I believe it will happen inevitably, the Japanese will definitely be involved as a U.S. proxy in that whole thing. And Japan will see it as an opportunity to expand their own little Monroe Doctrine, their own little sphere of influence. My great-grandfather received 2 St. George's Crosses during the Russo-Japanese War. Damn, that's awesome. That was a crazy, crazy, tragic war. Battle of Mukden, Russia suffered 90,000 casualties. I mean, it's quite horrendous what happened. Chinese were losing because they were dealing with civil war. Yes, that's true. That's true. But they weren't dealing with civil war in the first Sino-Japanese War, and they lost. I think the Japanese are better at war than the Chinese. It's my opinion. Trump wants to wash America's hands of security. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. Taiwan's true value to NATO is more proximity to China and chips. That is correct. That's right. Yeah, there's definitely an industrial / geopolitical interest involved in all this. And I'll go back to the article from Mr. Raja. Taiwan first appeared in Chinese records in 239 CE, which is Christian era. It's just basically saying AD. Remained a Dutch colony from 1624 to 1661 and was administered by China's Qing dynasty from 1683 to 1895, when Japan occupied Taiwan after winning the First Sino-Japanese War. That's true. So that gives you the historical context in all this. Japan defeated China, took Taiwan, then World War II happens. China loses Taiwan to China. So if China invades Taiwan, best believe that Japan will be involved. I know a lot of you like to think, a lot of you guys tend to think that Japan is a bunch of Sailor Moon fans. They watch Pokemon all day and they're not really interested in war. But things shift, trust me, and things are going to shift. When the war in Ukraine first broke out, I said it right from the beginning. I said, guys, watch Germany. Watch frickin' Germany. And what's happening right now? The Germans are talking about bringing back conscription, making their military bigger, building up their military capacity and their innovation. They're talking about being war ready, being ready to send soldiers into a front line with the Russians. I mean, things have changed very fast. You think Japan is stupid enough to engage China? Because if so, China will have to strike targets. Japan is preparing for war. I don't know if you've noticed that, but there's been a whole shift within Japanese policy that's been going on for the past 10 years or so to make Japan war ready. That's why they have changed the constitution so as to allow Japan to be involved in wars. Japan is not constitutionally supposed to be allowed in wars. That's the post-World War II mandate for Japan. That has changed. They have changed or they have made alterations in the interpretation of the Constitution, something like that, so as to allow Japan to constitutionally say we can be involved in a conflict. That's a big shift. Japan has one of the biggest militaries in the world. Japan is one of the biggest military spenders in the world. A lot of things have changed since the 1960s. I mean, I think Trump will exude strength and will be truly threatening to China. Yeah, he's going to be a big anti-China guy, more so than an anti-Russia guy. That's my prediction about him. But Japan has changed a lot. Yes, there is over 100 million people in Japan. People say, oh, they have a dying population, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't stop countries from going to war. If anything, that is actually if anything, that makes a perfect ground for recruitment. If you have too many people getting married and having babies, they can be less willing to go to war because they don't want to die because they have family back at home. You got a bunch of single Japanese people who are miserable and angry with the world. Yeah, they have nothing to lose, no family to protect. They can die and be cannon fodder for a war. Absolutely. The whole, what's it called? Kikikomori? What's it called? Kikikomori or whatever? Hikikomori, whatever it's called. Basically a bunch of incels who stay home and play video games. Yeah, perfect killers. They're perfect killers. Yeah, drag those people out, draft them into the military, teach them how to use a bayonet and a rifle, and yeah, you'll have yourself a cold, heartless killer. I'm telling you, people think I'm crazy when I say these things. Yeah, Japan is a NATO ally. It has very advanced military technology. It's building up its military. It can amass a military of millions of soldiers if it has to. Japan's no joke, guys. It has quite a big navy, quite a substantial navy. It is nothing to mess around with. And China is nothing to mess around with either. That's why I'm saying it's going to be a hell of a time in the future. I mean, I think... I already read that. Sorry. Yeah, but anyway. So it says here that China took the island again in 1945 after Japan lost World War II. A civil war erupted in mainland China between nationalist government forces led by Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong's Communist Party. Communists won in 1949 and it took control of mainland. So the Communists won the civil war. The nationalists went down to Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist party, Kuomintang, fled to Taiwan, where they ruled for the next several decades. Taiwanese thus claim they were never part of the modern Chinese state that was first formed in 1911, or the people. So basically, communists took over, the nationalists fled, and then the nationalists have been saying, listen, we're not part of you guys. We never consented to be under communism, so we are our own country. And I think that's where the contention lies. The contention doesn't lie on whether or not China once controlled Taiwan. The contention lies on whether or not Taiwan is an independent country. Now, in theory, it looks like, or not in theory, but in practice, Taiwan looks like an independent country, acts like an independent country. On paper, it's supposed to be a part of China, so the Chinese say it's part of our territory. It was given over to China after World War II, so understandably so that the Chinese feel that way. Therefore, any sort of cyber rattling or any sort of military involvement around Taiwan is going to be a provocation for the Chinese. It's like Russia and Ukraine, where you have the head of the CIA, William Burns, telling Condoleezza Rice, hey, Ukraine is the reddest of all the red lines for Russia. If you mess with Ukraine, Russia will see it as a provocation. You also have the whole Niet means Niet memo, where NATO told the Russians, yeah, we're not going to expand eastward, and it has been expanding eastward. So it's just, it's a big provocation against the Russians and the Chinese. It's very dangerous what we're doing. We are really messing with fire here, guys. We should not be doing this. I think we should be respecting each other's spheres of influence. Superpowers need to be respecting each other's spheres of influence. There's no point in starting a world war. I think it's just crazy. What's the point? You're just millions and millions upon millions of people are going to be killed. This is why I think the biggest criminals ever are these warmongers. Lindsey Graham, the John McCains of the world. I think these are just pure criminals. These countries, Germany, Japan, are all preparing for war just like you've been. Yeah, they are, absolutely. I've been saying this for over 10 years. Yes, read the news about Japan. Japan is on its way to becoming the second or third biggest military spender in the world. Since when was Japan allowed to remilitarize after World War II? They've been remilitarizing for decades. They have one of the biggest navies. They have a substantial army already. They can definitely make that army a lot bigger than it already is. They have been purchasing big-time NATO weapons, and they're on their way to having their own fighter jet being in full independent operation. Yeah, you can look into this, guys. Shinzo Abe gone. Whom do you think, Theo, will take the reins of unifying militarism? I have no clue. It could be Mr. What's his name? The guy who's the Prime Minister of Japan right now. What's his name? Shinoda? Bishida? What's his name? Kishida? Mr. Kishida, this dude. U.S. Marines are already in Taiwan and even on the Kinmen, just a few miles off base. Yeah, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that Japan is not a factor, guys. It says here that the U.S. formally established diplomatic ties with Beijing in 1979. So late 70s, America had some sort of diplomacy with the Chinese. 1991, it proclaimed that the war with the People's Republic of China was over. So the Taiwanese said, okay, no more war with China. China proposed the one country, two systems option, and the United States has been honoring this term for a very long time now. America will be very careful when talking about Taiwan being an independent country. So there's the whole one country, two systems policy that the U.S. has had for a while, where they'll just say, yeah, China. Yeah, they're not going to say, oh, yeah, Taiwan, the independent country that's separate from China. They just say Taiwan, or they say China. In other words, they treat Taiwan as if it's still part of China. This is why Donald Trump, when it comes to China, Donald Trump is a huge provocateur. And if he becomes the president, and I think he will become the president, Donald Trump is going to be a huge provocateur against the Chinese. I know this already because he was a provocateur when he was president. When Trump was the president, he said, I just got off the phone with the president of Taiwan. And that pissed off the Chinese because it went against the one country, two systems policy within American political discourse. Because you're not supposed to say the president of Taiwan. You should just say Taiwan or whatever. Don't say the president of Taiwan because that implies that Taiwan is an independent country and that angers the Chinese. Chinese are very sensitive about this type of stuff. But we all know what Trump was doing. He was provoking the Chinese. And it says here that a year after Mr. Chen was elected in 2004, so in 2005, China passed its anti-secession law, stating China's right to use non-peaceful means against Taiwan if it tried to secede from China. So China takes this very seriously. Now, why does China take this so seriously? Well, we're going to find out. So Mr. Raja put up a whole list here of why Taiwan is so important for the Chinese. I'm just going to read out the parts that I've highlighted here. President Xi Jinping, in his 2017 report to the 19th Party Congress, set a deadline for reunification by 2049. So they want to fully reunify Taiwan with China by 2049, stating that complete national reunification is an inevitable requirement for realizing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This goal is part of a broader vision to restore China's historical status and national pride. So basically, if we don't control Taiwan, everyone's going to think that we're simps. We got to show how tough we are. We got to show that we are truly a major superpower by maintaining our sphere of influence. Historical humiliation. Taiwan's status as a separate entity serves as a constant reminder to the Chinese leadership and its people of the century of humiliation when China was subjugated to and exploited by foreign powers. So we're not going to be anyone's bitch. That's what that means. China perceives Taiwan as a crucial part of its regional sphere of influence. Control over Taiwan is essential for China's territorial integrity and national security. In other words, if we don't control Taiwan, that means that we don't have the strength to maintain our national integrity, our national sphere of influence, and we don't want to be seen as anyone's simp. Taiwan's semiconductor. So this is where things become economic. Taiwan's so it says here, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, which dominates over half of the global market for computer chips, is vital for many electronic devices worldwide. Control over Taiwan would give China dominance in one of the world's most critical industries, and this is true. It's also very important. It's why the Americans are focusing on Taiwan so much, because to control Taiwan would mean to control really half of the global market for computer chips or semiconductors. Reunification with Taiwan is central to China's ambitions of becoming a global superpower. Any declaration of independence by Taiwan without a strong response from China would undermine its aspirations for global dominance. In other words, we are no one's bitch, and we will not tolerate any sort of declaration of independence within our sphere of influence, because to tolerate such an action would basically make us look weak. Control over Taiwan would allow China to extend its military reach further into the Pacific Ocean. So if we control Taiwan, we have a deeper foothold into the Pacific Ocean. It would also enable China to control major shipping routes in Asia. So this is a pretty big deal, right? Control over shipping routes, having a deeper military reach into the Pacific Ocean. All these things are pretty big deals. Controlling half of the global market for semiconductors, very big deal. Dominating Taiwan would disrupt the USA's island chain strategy, which serves as a barrier to Chinese expansion into the Western Pacific. So there you go. And then it says here that the USA's policy of strategic ambiguity has historically meant that it was blah, blah, blah. Okay. If China were to take over Taiwan, it would gain a significant strategic advantage in the Western Pacific region. A failure to defend Taiwan would send the wrong signals to other U.S. allies if the region, such as Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, about American sincerity, seriousness, and in other words, if America doesn't do something in the case of China invading Taiwan, then Japan will think, well, why should we rely on the Americans? And then America would lose its grip and its whole security umbrella. So the whole thing is a big geopolitical quagmire, and it's just a room full of gasoline. All that is necessary for the whole thing to explode into a conflagration of geopolitical chaos would be just a little match of incitement. I mean, it's pretty scary what's happening. It's pretty scary what's happening. Chinese declare it's their own fucking turf. Exactly, right? I hate all this geopolitical lingo. I wish they would just make things very plain for people to understand. This is China's turf. Don't fuck with it. That's it. This is America's turf. Don't fuck with it. Very simple, guys. It's not that complicated at all. Ukraine is Russia's turf. Don't fuck with it. And that's it. We should just respect people's sphere of influence, and that's that. NATO has not done that, and we are going to suffer the consequences for this. And that's the bottom line. It's very scary what's happening, guys. Very scary what's happening. But it is eventually going to erupt. I know some people like to be doom and gloom, to be sensationalist. That is not my case at all. I do not want to be sensationalist. I do want to be just plain with the reality. And the reality is that there's incitement being done. You could say that China has also done incitement. You're probably right. But still, it doesn't really take away from the fact that NATO has been pushing the Chinese dragon, so to speak. I think we can make a deal with China. They help us get the chips manufacturing. I have no problem with what you just said. I completely am in favor for an option where there is peace and security, everyone's satisfied, and there is no war. And that's just, I don't want war. If China ever does start to succeed at conquering Taiwan, I wonder if the U.S. or Taiwanese militaries will destroy the chip factories. I think what will happen in the case of a war between China and Taiwan is America is going to tell Japan to unleash hell. That's what I think eventually will happen. And Japan will go nuclear. That's another thing that people don't realize, is that Japan is already a de facto nuclear state. Japan has the capacity to build nuclear weapons in a matter of months. So if Japan wants to build nukes, it definitely can. Again, this is totally against the protocol that was established after World War II. But we basically have taken the post-World War II protocol, pistol over it, and threw it out the window. We don't give a shit about it anymore. Yeah. For example, the Senkaku Island tension, or the tension between Japan and China over the Senkaku Islands. I mean, they call them the Senkaku Islands. They're not really islands. Let's be real here, guys. The Senkaku is just really a bunch of big rocks sticking out from the water. There are some, I think there are some, or at least one type of natural resource around the boulders. I think some kind of minerals or whatever, but the islands unto themselves have no serious value. Again, you can't really live on them. Maybe you can build a couple of houses on one of them. I'm not entirely sure, but they're just really big rocks coming out of the ocean. That's all they really are. And the Chinese say, don't mess with it. It's part of our integrity. It's part of our sovereignty. If you mess with it, we have to mess with you. Bottom line. It's like if you had a plate full of food, burger and fries, and somebody came over and just kept stealing the fries off your plate, eventually you're going to get up and punch that person. Well, they're just fries, but this is my personal space, and you keep encroaching upon my personal space, and I cannot tolerate that bullshit, because I will not allow you to put your frickin' flag on me. Is America going to go to war with China? I don't know, but I definitely do know that America will be using Japan as a proxy. And the Japanese will say, get the samurai back from the dead. I do want to show you guys something interesting here. This is an article from Jeffrey Sachs. It was published on The Hill. I did highlight some telling and interesting parts. So we talked about Taiwan. Let's talk about Ukraine. So now we have a better knowledge, right, of the context surrounding the tension between China and Taiwan. We got a better context, better understanding of the context. So that way, when the war breaks out, we can remember, okay, hold on. Ted did a video about this. Okay, yeah, Taiwan used to belong to China. Japan took it. First Sino-Japanese War, 1895, and then the Chinese took it back after World War II. Taiwan says we're independent. America sees it as independent. China says, no, you belong to me. And Japan will have to be in the forefront of the war in the case of a Chinese incursion into Taiwan. Now, in all fairness to myself, I was talking about Ukraine for years before the war broke out. I uploaded an old video I did on Ukraine back in 2008. You can see it. It's Ukraine, and it's something like Ukrainian Nazis and hatred towards Russians or something like that. I made that video in 2018. I first started talking about Ukraine in 2014, so over a decade ago. So I was seeing the writing on the wall for a while. I had been seeing the writing on the wall for a while that something was definitely wrong with Ukraine. And then in 2018, I basically said, listen, guys, there's a big problem with Ukraine. That Nazi shit's going to get out of hand. It's getting out of hand. And I said that back in 2018. So I'm going to start uploading more of my older videos. But I want to read to you guys some excerpts from this article. Not too much, just a little bit here. So it says here, there was a line from Henry Kissinger that Mr. Sachs quotes that I find quite true. It says, it may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. Yep. 3 years ago, Ukraine was embraced by America's neoconservatives who believed that it was the perfect instrument for weakening Russia. Okay, so it says here, this was the neoconservative plan: meddle in Ukraine's internal politics. Second, expand NATO to Ukraine despite Russia's red line. And third, arm Ukraine and apply economic sanctions to defeat Russia. This has been the neocon plan, and it's in operation. The neocons whispered a sweet fantasy into Ukraine's ear back in the 1990s. Come with us into the glorious paradise of NATO land, and you'll be safe ever after. So it says here, NATO enlargement to Ukraine, however, would mean the loss of Russia's Black Sea naval fleet at Sevastopol and the prospect of U.S. missiles minutes from the Russian mainland. So Ukraine is a very big deal. Ukraine becomes a NATO ally or a NATO member. Bam. Before you know it, you got NATO putting some big-ass missiles in Ukraine, and Ukraine is right within... It's really right within Russia's line of fire. So from Ukraine, you can easily hit Russia, and Ukraine has hit Russia. The current CIA director, William Burns, said as much in a memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice when he was U.S. ambassador to Moscow in 2008. The memo was famously entitled, "Niet means niet, no means no. We're not going to expand NATO eastward." Burns wrote, quote, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all the red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle-draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russia's interests." That's how the Russians have seen it, and the Americans knew this. My opinion is that what the Americans' goal was to bleed out Russia. It was basically to work with the Ukrainians, talk about putting Ukraine in NATO, provoke the Russians into a war, and they knew that the Ukrainians were not going to win this. Everyone knows that Ukraine can't win a war against Russia by itself. So the end goal, I believe, was to bleed Russia. To bleed Russia. In other words, to have Russia suffer through tremendous casualties. Even though Russia is going to win the war, it's going to be more of a Pyrrhic victory where you have a lot of dead Russians, and the weight of that sad reality is already being felt in Russia. So I think NATO knew, we'll provoke the Russians. We know the Russians will win, but we'll bleed them and we'll weaken the Russians by them losing manpower and them possibly losing morale. Pretty certain the Russians have a lot of morale, more so than the people here in the United States. And I think that's the end goal. Reminds me of what the Americans did in Afghanistan, arming the Mujahideen, provoking the Soviets to invade Afghanistan, and then bleed the Soviet Union by having the Russians suffer casualties fighting the Afghans. This was what Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski essentially said. He said, "We provoked the Soviets, and that was the whole goal: was to provoke them into Afghanistan, to bleed them out, to weaken them." SS Galatian. Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So it says here, I'll start to believe. So some American guy named John Kirby. Hold on a second. No, sorry, my mistake. Let's rewind a little bit here. So there's a very common argument that Ukraine wanted to join NATO and it has every right to join NATO. Who the hell is Russia to say that Ukraine has no right to join NATO? So to respond to that very common argument, Mr. Sachs writes here, I'll start to believe that claim when Admiral John Kirby declares from the White House podium that Mexico has the quote-unquote right to invite China and Russia to put military bases along the Rio Grande, based on the same open-door policy as NATO. The Monroe Doctrine has said just the opposite for 2 centuries. So Ukraine was set up for disaster by the neocons. Actually, the Ukrainian public sensed the truth and overwhelmingly opposed NATO membership until the 2014 uprising. So I looked into this, and it turns out to be true. Check this out here. Support within Ukraine for joining NATO was at an all-time low before 2014. So October 2013, 66% of Ukrainians were against joining NATO. 2012, 60%. 2012, 66%. July of 2012, 70%. April of 2012, 62%. You go back down, January of 2011, 70% of Ukrainians were against it. All of a sudden, 2014, it starts to change. 47% were against it. 48% were against it. 42%. That's still quite substantial. So it's not like, oh, yes, Ukrainians were overwhelmingly in favor of joining NATO. That wasn't the case. Hello, Bruce Harris. Weakening Russia is not what happened. Well, we'll see. We'll see the aftermath of this war. We'll see how much it affected it. That's why I'm saying it's my theory. It hasn't been confirmed. The story of Idel Ural battalions, however, was the most hilarious thing in the war. I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you can educate us on that one, Mr. Nestia. Z said Biden baited him into attacking Taiwan many times, but the Russian experience in Ukraine served as a lesson. Ah, I see. The Taiwanese government is the true legitimate Chinese government. When the communists took over China, the Chinese government went to Taiwan to set up a government in exile. Okay. Again, that's not how the Chinese see it. That's the whole point. The point is that the Chinese see Taiwan as a red line for them, just like the Russians see Ukraine as a red line. China wants to maintain its sphere of influence. China does not want an island next to it that could actually be used as a big launching pad. Japan needs to fix their free-falling currency before thinking about war. We'll see what happens with that. So here's another article from Mr. Sachs. I'm going to read to you guys this excerpt here. I found this to be, again, quite revealing. I'll enlarge the text here. Burns, so Mr. William Burns, now CIA director, was U.S. ambassador to Russia in 2008 and author of a memo entitled Niet Means Niet. In that memo, Burns explained to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice that the entire Russian political class, not just Putin, was dead set against NATO enlargement. We know about the memo only because it was leaked, otherwise we'd be in the dark about it. Why does Russia oppose NATO enlargement? For the simple reason that Russia does not accept the U.S. military on its 2,300-kilometer border with Ukraine in the Black Sea region. Russia does not appreciate the U.S. placement of Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania after the U.S. unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile ABM treaty. It's very understandable why Russia is upset, because NATO is within firing distance from Russia. It can fire at Russia. It's within striking distance of Russia. And Russia doesn't like that. No country would like that. So, what do we have here? This is my... I'm not going to do this because it reminds me of that Catholic show. I'm not going to mention its name. But what do we have here? We have America, we have China, but then we also have these external powers that used to be very powerful, and now they're not very powerful, or they're not as powerful as they used to be, and they are aspiring to become powerful again. So in the case of Ukraine is a Black Sea country. Turkey is on the Black Sea, so Turkey and Ukraine are neighbors. Russia is at war with Ukraine. Turkey has had many wars with Russia in the past. Turkey is an historical enemy with Russia. Turkey also wants to have more control over the Black Sea. Turkey also controls access ways into the Mediterranean, which Russia needs, because Russia needs that access into the Mediterranean because it has a port in Syria. So there's that. You have historical enemies, Russia and Turkey. The war between Ukraine and Russia is being seen as an opportunity, more or less, for the Ukrainians or for the Turks to really get back in the fray with the Russians. So there's that, right? Turkey wants to control the Black Sea. Russia wants to control the Black Sea. They are historical enemies. And Turkey is NATO's bulldog against Russia. So if NATO really, really wants to mess with the Russians, NATO's going to tell Turkey, don't let the Russians in through the Mediterranean. And then if Turkey seriously begins to block the Russians from going into the Mediterranean, that'll be an act of war. And you got a serious problem. So you have a war between Russia and Ukraine, but there's an outside player. That's Turkey. And remember what happened some years ago. Mr. Erdogan was hanging out with the Tatar Muslims of Crimea. And why was he doing that? Because the Tatars are Turks, and the people in Anatolia, which is what Turkey is. Turkey is really just Anatolia. The people of Anatolia identify themselves with the Tatars. So Turkey is really desirous of using the Tatars as a proxy against the Russians. And then you have the whole thing with Constantinople versus Moscow, the religious aspect of this all. the Ukrainians said, well, we want our own church. We want a Ukrainian Orthodox church that's not under the Moscow Patriarchate. The CIA comes along and tells Mr. Bartholomew, the patriarch of the church in Constantinople, the Greek church in Constantinople, to give a blessing to the idea of a Ukrainian Orthodox church independent of the Moscow Patriarchate. And Bartholomew abided by this request. He honored this request and said, yeah, I give a blessing. So he gave a blessing to this church, this group of churches, I should say, that are independent of the Moscow Patriarchate, and said, yeah, they're legitimate churches. Well, a number of those churches are actually Ukrainian nationalist churches. So the Russians said, well, to hell with the Greek Orthodox Church, because the Greek Orthodox Church said, we recognize this cluster of independent Ukrainian churches. And the Russians told the Greeks, to hell with you. You recognized a group of churches that are really splinter groups, and some of them are antagonistic towards the Russians, or I should say all of them are antagonistic towards the Russians. So we're not going to honor this. And we're not going to recognize this church or these groups, this cluster of churches. And for the Greeks to recognize this makes the Greeks religious enemies of us. The Egyptians said, we recognize it, and the Russians told the Egyptians, to hell with you too, Egypt. To hell with the Coptic Church. So there's a split now between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. And by having an independent Ukrainian church, NATO can then say, well, they have their own church. That's their church. Now the Ukrainians can persecute the Orthodox Church that's under Moscow because that is seen as basically a satellite of the Kremlin. So NATO is enabling persecution of Russian Orthodox Christians or Ukrainian Orthodox Christians who want to be in the church that's under Moscow. So there's a religious front in this war, which makes it even more fascinating. Well, it's pretty sad and tragic, but it's still fascinating nonetheless. And then you have Germany. And let's look. I wanted to show you guys something here real quick. Hold on. I left my phone on the side of my room here. I'm going to read to you guys something here. So I want to read to you guys this article, and it is about Trump's plan for Ukraine. Trump's plan is to make Germany more powerful so as to leave the responsibility for Ukraine on the shoulders of Germany. So look what it says here. I just want to read to you guys a couple parts here. So here is some bullet points of the plan. Want to get the right part. So here's really the last part. Here's a quote from Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo is a scoundrel from the CIA. But it says here, if Russia complies with these terms, the West will gradually lift sanctions. So the terms are basically, in this plan at least, we don't know what's going to happen, but in Trump's supposed plan, the terms are basically sanctions will be imposed on Russia as long as Russia maintains controlling Ukrainian territory, insists on controlling Ukrainian territory. Crimea will be demilitarized. And then there's going to be a $100 billion loan, or really America will fund Ukraine by just giving it loans instead of giving it grants. Then there's a $100 billion budget that will be reserved for Ukraine. So $500 billion as a lend-lease program. So just basically indebting Ukraine. And then it says here, the alliance would also create a $100 billion fund. So the NATO alliance will create a $100 billion fund to arm Kiev, with the U.S. contributing 20% of the total. And then Mike Pompeo goes on to say, if Russia complies with these terms, the West will gradually lift sanctions. They will be fully removed once Ukraine is in both NATO and the EU. So basically, we're going to impose sanctions on the Russians as long as Ukraine is not in NATO and Russia is insisting on controlling Ukrainian territory. and that the sanctions will be lifted once Ukraine is officially a part of NATO and the EU. So if Trump does this plan, guys, I think Trump is going to be provoking Russia even more than what Biden has been doing, in all honesty. Really, it's crazy. So I really hope that, well, I'll get to that in a moment. Let me just read to you guys this part here. These steps, and not the half measures of the Biden administration, will end the war, establish a lasting peace, ensure Europe bears the burden of maintaining it, and reestablish freedom and security on the continent. But that last part is one that I'm really focusing on here. Europe bears the burden of maintaining it. That is empowering Germany. It's giving the green light to Germany to revive their power. So we are currently seeing the process of the revival of German power in Europe, and that's what we're seeing. Now, the Trump plan is saying, hey, Russia is going to need to leave Ukraine, honor its integrity, and then Ukraine is going to be put in the process of joining NATO and the European Union. This is partially quite unrealistic. And what I mean by that is that Russia has been doing all this fighting, losing all this manpower, not to say to Trump, "Oh yeah, okay, we're gonna bounce out of here." Russia is not going to leave empty-handed. Russia is going to want territory, and that's the bottom line. Either the United States government is going to say, "All right, Russia, you don't want to leave territory, you don't want to leave the East, then we're going to maintain the war against you," or the Americans are going to say, "All right, take the territory." Those are the only two possibilities. And if America decides to maintain the war against Russia, then it's going to continue to escalate. It's going to be another step towards a greater escalation, which is going to be disastrous. And by that, I mean it's just going to be another step towards a major global conflict between Russia and its allies and NATO and its allies. It's very sad what's happening. My hope is that the Americans will say to the Russians, okay, take the East, take the territory that you've conquered, leave the rest alone, and we'll have a ceasefire. But I think Russia is not going to tolerate Ukraine being allowed into NATO. I just don't see that happening. Russia does not want any further NATO expansion, especially not in Ukraine. So, nothing good. There is really nothing good to expect, unless you believe in miracles, in which case I do believe in miracles, and I do hope and I do anticipate seeing miracles, because I do believe in miracles. I do. I truly do believe in miracles. And this is part of God's plan. And in the midst of all the chaos, we have to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We have to. It takes a lot of strength to see the light at the end of the tunnel, a lot of inner strength to see the light, to witness the light at the end of the tunnel, but we have to. Or else we lose our humanity, guys. We lose our humanity. It's very tempting to be pro-NATO, but at the same time, when you look at all of the details, when you look at the totality of the circumstances, it's just, it's not fitting to be gung-ho for NATO. It's not fitting to be gung-ho for the American side, because what you see is provocation and incitement. We have to allow cooler heads to prevail. If we don't, then the hot-headed ones will ruin us, and our hubris will ruin us. Destruction will come, but hope will prevail.